Welcome to module number 4, where we are going to explore the different quantitative thresholds for operating segment. An entity should report separately information about each operating segment that meets any of the following quantitative thresholds. So any of the following quantitative thresholds might be met by an operating segment. So in this case, it will be considered a reportable operating segment. Let's start with the first quantitative threshold as per IFRS number 8. The first quantitative threshold is related to the revenue. So look at the revenue of the operating segment. This revenue that include both internal sales and external sales. So if the total revenue of that operating segment represent 10% of the total revenue of all operating segments, so in this case, it will be considered as reportable. So the first condition is related to 10% of the total revenue for the operating segment. The second quantitative threshold is related to the reported profit or reported loss. So let's assume that our company include 10 operating segments. 6 of these operating segments achieve the profit and the remaining 4 achieve the loss. So look on the absolute amount of the profit or loss for these 6 operating segments and these 4 operating segments. Look at the absolute amount. Don't consider the sign. Sum up the profit for the first 6, sum up the loss of the other remaining 4 operating segments, and select the higher, the greater. So if the total profit of the first 6 operating segments that achieved the profit is higher than the total loss of the other 4 operating segments that achieved the loss, so this will be the base that you are going to decide based on. So select the greater of the total profit or total loss. The greater will be the base that you are going to decide based on. So how can we decide? Consider 10% of the greater. So if your operating segment represent 10% or more of the greater of the total profit or total loss, so in this case, it will be considered as reportable operating segment. The third quantitative threshold is related to the assets. So if the operating segment assets represent 10% of the total operating segment assets, so in this case, it will be considered as a reportable. What does it mean? It means, again, that if you have 10 operating segments, sum up all of their assets. So now consider 10% out of this total number of the total assets of this operating segment. If your operating segment achieved at minimum 10% of the total assets of this total operating segment, so it will be considered reportable. So in order to summarize the previous 3 quantitative thresholds, it is 10%, 10%, 10%, 10% of revenue, 10% of profit or loss, 10% of the assets. So it is easy to be memorized like this way. So it's called 10% test. Now, after assessing the reportable segment or operating segment based on the previous 3 quantitative thresholds, there is another final quantitative threshold that must be met for all reportable segments, is that the combined revenue from all reportable segments should equal at least 75% of the total revenue of the company. So what does it mean? If you have, for example, 10 operating segments, and based on the above conditions, you selected 3 of them to be reportable. So now for these 3 that would be considered as being reportable, sum up their revenue. If their revenue represents 75% of the total revenue of the company, so in this case, they met this condition. But what if these 3 reportable segments doesn't reach to 75% or doesn't meet the 75% of the total revenue of the company? So in this case, you are going to select one from the other rejected operating segments to add it and consider it as reportable in order to achieve the minimum, which is 75% of the total revenue of the company. In the next module, we are going to take an example in order to explore how to decide and how to assess the different operating segments to be considered as reportable.